Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today we start Unit 7 and we begin with the concept of imperialism. As we close out the 19th century and begin the 20th, America is looking beyond its borders to connect markets, but also to grow its influence across the globe. Our story really begins with ideas. So, why would the US have a new manifest destiny, go beyond the continental United States? Well, really based on the ideas of two books. The first one by a man named Alfred Thayer Mahan, entitled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. It really focuses on how Great Britain became an international power in the period between 1660 or so and the late 1700s, but his thesis actually goes back all the way to the Portuguese and the Dutch of the 13 and 1400s, the Spanish Empire in the 1500s and early 1600s, which was then displaced by the British. But what all those nations share in common is that they created colonial outposts and they were able to protect their interests, at least for some period of time, through having a large navy. His thesis is that the United States, in order to become the next nation, to do this, is going to have to further invest in its Navy and therefore be able to control its commercial interests across the globe. Our second book is by a man named Josiah Strong, who was a Protestant minister who was looking in his text, Our Country, for some ways in which Americans could begin to take these WASP values, white Anglo Saxon values, that people held dear and saw as intrinsic to the success of the United States and its people. But now, perhaps things like liberty, certainly Christianity, might be exported abroad. And these two in tandem are going to be used to justify imperialist interests for the United States in the next part of our course. So, the new manifest destiny, old manifest destiny, was within the continental United States. After the Civil War, people are looking beyond that. So, we're closing the frontier. And so now, where else do we go? And not to forget the other powerful ideas of the time. Certainly, social Darwinism will play a role in this, that the people of America, certainly WASP people of America, were individuals who had achieved greatness in a relatively short period of time. Shouldn't they be exporting those ideas abroad, but also continuing to shore up and increase the United States' economic and political power globally? And we're going to see that the US is also looking to have greater control and influence just upon its own hemisphere. So, building on those ideas of the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, by the 1880s and 1890s, we're actually beginning to insert ourselves with other nations. So, Venezuela will go through a series of border disputes in the 1890s. By the early 1900s, we'll be intervening on the behalf of a group of people in Colombia known as the Panamanians and helping them eventually create their own nation. But imperialism means you have an empire. And the United States, its empire will be a trickle. We will purchase Alaska in the late 1860s, what's known as Seward's Folly. We will work on getting other lands in the Pacific during that time as well. So the Midway Islands, which are literally midway between California and Japan. Also, we will start getting control of parts of Samoa in the 1870s, but we'll have full control by 1900. But you'll notice that a lot of these island chains are going to become part of the United States in 1898. And you will see in the Caribbean a similar case as well. There's also going to be some other places where we will just have economic influence, like Cuba and Panama in this time period. But whether it's a political control or military control or economic, we're going well beyond our shores. And we've mentioned this before in class, but it's important to consider that what was intrinsically valued in the time period before our own are not always the same things. We've looked much at the oil empires of the 20th and 21st century. You need to understand that in the late 19th century, the product that was still incredibly profitable, but one, much like oil, will have its own barons and monopolists, will be the production of sugar. And sugar, if you remember all the way back to units 1 and 2, there's limited places where it can be grown. It has to be grown essentially in a tropical climate. There was very little sugar being grown, sugarcane, that is in the Louisiana area at the turn of the 20th century. Most of the sugar grown globally is going to be grown in the Caribbean still, and also in the Hawaiian Islands in the Pacific. We're also going to see that fresh fruits, in particular citrus fruits, things like pineapple and bananas, they also are grown in a tropical climate, so outside of the United States. Why does this matter? Well, those goods, if they were to come into the United States, would be tariffed items. You'd be paying an import tax. And as we know, that could be somewhere upwards of 40% or more the price of the good. So there was a lot of jockeying politically to either not have import duties on these very prized items or find ways in which to circumvent. So ultimately, how do you take land that doesn't belong to the United States and make it part of the United States? And that's certainly the story of Hawaii. And you can see a picture here of their last monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, who will lose control of her island and her monarchy in 1898. But the United States has some very good reasons for why it wants to control the Pacific, whether we think those are legitimate today or not. But we had the beginnings of Pacific trade, and the Pacific is a much wider ocean than we see in the Atlantic. And so the United States was going to need, based on the technology of the time, harbors, ports, places where ships could refuel and restaff and go under repair. And so island chains like Hawaii and Guam and Samoa and the Midway Islands become significant in the quest to exert greater control economically and by the turn of the 20th century militarily in the Pacific. Hawaii itself was a culture of people who had long existed before Europeans and Americans arrived, originally called the Sandwich Islands, named after the gentleman who funded much of the exploration to Hawaii in the late 1700s, named the Earl of Sandwich. But the Hawaiian Islands were an island chain with people who had a pre-existing culture. They were numerous. They had their own language and their own monarchy. And so when the Europeans and Americans first encountered them, they treated them as a nation state. And actually, the kings and queens of Hawaii up through the 1890s will travel all over the world, be received by other monarchies and heads of state. But over time, the Hawaiian Islands, the monarchy will sell off or lease land to American and European investors, mostly for fruit and sugar production. And by the 1840s, you're going to see disease wreak havoc on the indigenous people, much like it did in other parts of the globe, and the importation of new workers, primarily from places like Japan and China. But sugar is going to be a major export, and there's going to be a lot of plantations. And we know what plantations look like in terms of the relationship between landowner and worker. By 1890, the sugar interests have managed to convince the United States Congress to eliminate a tariff on sugar if it comes from Hawaii. But over the next 8 years, there'll be a push to outright take control of Hawaii based on the number of Americans who own land there. And in 1898, in the midst of something called the Spanish-American War, the U.S. Congress will annex Hawaii under the protest of Queen Liliuokalani. But at that point, she and her family before her had allowed the U.S. government to build a military base at Pearl Harbor. It becomes the home of the Pacific Fleet. And it was not as though she was in any position to thwart this process of annexation. And so it goes through, and Hawaii is never the same. Samoa is also another island chain a little south and west of Hawaii that serves a similar purpose, which was to be a place of refueling for the U.S. Navy, but also to some degree, some of the plantation agriculture. that you saw elsewhere, but on a much smaller scale. So in 1898, the United States, and it may seem kind of strange today, goes to war with Spain. Why would we do that? Is Spain still part of the New World? In fact, it is. Spain has been an empire on the decline since the late 1500s, early 1600s, thanks to Great Britain. But that the point we're speaking about, they still control the Philippine Islands, which is an archipelago in the South Pacific, and had several million people living upon it. They also controlled Cuba, the Dominican Republic. They also had control of Puerto Rico. And all of those places were being utilized primarily for sugar production. And in the Far East, what will be the Philippines, was for rubber production, which was becoming ever more necessary with the inventions of the day. So Cuba was where the war ultimately begins. And the controversy behind Cuba is one, it's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. I'm going all the way back to the 1840s and 1850s. People had said, hey, let's go buy Cuba from Spain. Why? Well, because Cuba still had slavery. So Southern landowners who were looking to extend slavery before the Civil War often throughout this idea that Cuba should be an addition to the United States. But by 1868, Spain will abolish slavery in Cuba. But you have a culture of people who are the underclass, and they are descendants of some of the original settlers. They are descendants of the enslaved people who were brought there in the 1500s. You also have people who are part of the indigenous culture, what was left of it. And so it's a polyglot of people, but they are all seen as lying underneath the upper classes from Spain who still run the island. And it was under military rule after 1868. They used concentration camps. Anytime you saw native Cubans attempting to rise up against their Spanish overlords. And these stories were pretty salacious. We've been talking about mass media as it evolves in the Gilded Age, and William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer both controlled newspaper empires, and they needed readers. And so they focused on stories that captured the imagination. And it's much easier to speak about other people's treachery and horror than it is to sort of reveal your own in your own nation. And so we see the rise of yellow journalism and literally the stories, the pictures, certainly based in truth, but not always honest. But they were attempting to get eyeballs. And so the American public, by the mid 1890s, is pretty well aware of what life is like in Cuba and that perhaps Spain is a thing of the past. The way in which they control the island, um, well, they shouldn't. And something else should happen for these Cuban people. Perhaps they deserve liberty and to be free um, and no longer a colony. So in 1898, we see a series of stories that talk about the mistreatment of Cuban people. And the US government will broach a couple of different conversations with the Spanish government, expressing their concern about the situation, especially because, in theory, it only lies 90 miles off the coast of Florida. That's still a considerable distance of the day. But the US will send several ships from its Navy to come and observe, including the USS Maine. We will be making appeals to Spain itself to perhaps just simply release Cuba from being a colony. And this is something that Spain's not willing to do. Sugar's too valuable. Um, but eventually, we go beyond simply the atrocities in Spain, but it seems that there's some pushback from the nation of Spain directly to the United States government. And that happens in the form of something called the de Lome letter. Senor de Lome was a representative of Spain living in Washington, D.C., and it just happened that one of his letters, partially complete, but for whatever reason, he decided to throw it out and start again, had been discovered in the trash and released to William Randolph Hearst's newspaper empire and published. And when it was seen as such a slap in the face to the American people, especially in the fact that it is very negative towards the president of that time, William McKinley. So you can see it reads, the situation here remains the same. Everything depends on the political and military outcome in Cuba. Until then, nothing can be clearly seen, and I regard it as a waste of time to progress to be sending emissaries to the rebel camp or to try to ascertain the intentions and plans of the US government. Considering all the press and public opinion in Spain have said about General Weyler, it once more shows what President McKinley is, weak and a bitter for the admiration of the crowd, besides being a would-be politician who tries to leave the door open behind him while keeping on good terms with the jingos of his party. But the fact that someone who was supposed to be an honest broker representing his interests with Spain, but also open to resolving the conflict that's existing in Cuba, that seemed to work against it. Joseph Pulitzer spoke often about he needed eyeballs, and that as long as he could get pictures, he could then create the scenario by which he would get readers to his paper. So you furnish me the pictures, I'll furnish you the war. And ultimately, between the yellow journalism of the media, and certainly there is this group of people within the US government who see Cuba as a place that, yes, can become independent, and as an independent nation, perhaps become a far more significant trading partner with the United States. So there's lots of different interests for why Cuba could become ground zero for a war. But in 1898, the ship, the USS Maine, was off the coast of Cuba and exploded. And again, this becomes fodder for the newspapers of the day. And at that time, it was blamed on Spain that they deliberately mined the harbor in order to destroy the ship. In actual fact, the ship probably blew up due to negligence. These great warships of the day were still coal powered. So a boiler where hot coals escaped. If there was flammable material, and there was plenty of it, the vast majority of the deck space in these ships was oiled with regularity in order to easily move the ordnance, the shells that were fired from the big guns. And so you combine the fuel, an already potentially explosive device, and an unregulated boiler, you're probably going to get an explosion. But American lives were lost. The ship sunk off the coast of Cuba, and that was seen as legitimacy for going to war. So in April of 1898, Congress declares war for the third time. And by June, the United States is beginning to land soldiers. It's important to note that the US Army was only about 8,000 people at that time. We didn't have a large standing army. Our Navy also was relatively small as well. So they asked for volunteers from the get go. And that gentleman, if he looks familiar yet younger than the version that you've seen a couple of days ago, that is Theodore Roosevelt, who, although he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he quits his job so he can join up in the frenzy and go fight for the freedom of people in Cuba, and actually creates his own group of soldiers known as the Rough Riders. Their leadership, their officers were all friends of his from his Harvard days and his days out in the Badlands of the Dakotas. But it was a relatively ragtag and untrained army. Where it was well provisioned, it was because someone like Theodore Roosevelt bought his own uniform and other material in order to go and fight. But we will see the same kind of pattern that we saw during the Civil War, which is African Americans wanting to show their commitment to the country and liberty and going to fight as well. Three major battles and the war is over, and really in two parts. One, there was a very small ground force in Cuba that could hold back the American soldiers who arrived in June of that year, but also Spain is going to find itself having to fend off the United States from some of its other colonial possessions, including Puerto Rico and Guam. And so while it may seem like the war itself is in Cuba, much of what will become the climax and why the United States will win and acquire so much territory from this war is because the US Navy is going to be able to very quickly access and control some other of these colonial possessions. So the war itself was one in which the US certainly wanted to send ground forces to free the Cuban people. But there were other people considering all that was at stake. And again, Theodore Roosevelt is one of those people. As the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he knew how many ships the US had in the Pacific. He also realized that probably what Spain would do immediately after receiving this declaration of war from the United States is pull much of its naval fleet from the Philippines, try to go and protect Cuba. Well, before the Panama Canal, that was anywhere from a 4 to 6 month journey, all the way around the tip of South America. So as those ships steam away, TR, one of the last things he does as the assistant secretary, asks the commander of the Pacific Fleet, George Dewey, to take his ship and any others that are available and to take control of the capital city of Manila, which was on a bay. It was a harbor that was well sheltered, but not well protected once those Spanish ships leave. And so, literally, by the time US forces arrive in June, the United States Navy actually already controls the capital of the Philippines. And so, it is now ultimately a conflict to not only free Cuban people, in theory, but also to take away whatever other colonies in the Pacific or the Caribbean that Spain still has. And we can see here we've got an artist who, in this political cartoon, is kind of poking fun at the fact that America, whether that's the nation itself, the government, the people, is sitting down to eat, and he's trying to decide what he wants. The bill of fare, that's our menu. And what's on the menu? Well, it looks like you can have a Cuba steak, you can have Puerto Rico pig, you can have the Sandwich Islands. All of these things are being served up by our waiter, who has McKinley on his cloth here. So, in a sense, the president of the United States is willing to hand over all of this to the American people if they want. But this is going to open up some pretty interesting conversations. So, the United States has never had colonies. We were once a colony. We didn't like it very much. We had a revolution so we could be an independent nation. But we will have an armistice with Spain, what's now our third Treaty of Paris of 1898. And part of that negotiation is actually going to be to buy the Philippines for $20 million. Again, all of those islands are going to become territory of the United States, plus the millions of people who live in the Philippines. The Filipino people thought that they were perhaps being freed from Spanish control, but it turns out now they just have a different master. There will be an internal struggle against the United States that lasts for almost 3 years, what's called the Bolo War. But from 1901 to 1904, the United States will have to send its Marines to try to put down the civil unrest led by a man named Emilio Aguinaldo, who hoped to gain independence for his people, but was unsuccessful. The island very quickly will become dependent on the United States. And although eventually will become an independent nation in 1947, it will spend a great deal of time under the political and economic control of the United States. Cuba does become independent, but there are going to be some corollaries, some amendments that are going to restrict exactly what that independence looks like. So, although Cuba is politically independent, according to the Platt Amendment with this Treaty of Paris, the United States is going to put a provision on Cuba that it cannot make any treaties, it cannot engage in any trade without US approval, and the United States will be able to gain a lease and build a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which is still there today. Spain is going to fully cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, although the US had easily gained control of it in the summer of 1898. But we will see over the next 20 years, there will be case law that will have to handle, well, what happens when the United States takes on territories, takes on people who have a different language and different culture? What becomes known as the insular cases is a combination of lawsuits about whether or not the people who live in Puerto Rico or the Philippines are citizens. Just because you are living in a territory, does that make you a citizen of the United States? Because when we were talking about the continental United States and acquiring land, like the Louisiana Purchase, once that became territories, yes, the people who lived out there were US citizens, even if they lived in an area where there was no statehood. But if you were a Filipino or you were Puerto Rican, you were not a citizen based on the decision of the insular cases. And people debated, well, what are we talking about these places? Are they colonies? Are they not colonies? Well, the Supreme Court said they're certainly not states. And the comfortable term was territories. The US had territories, not colonies, but that's really just a word. By 1916 and 1917, there'll be a series of laws passed known as the Jones Acts, and they will establish some different provisions. So Puerto Ricans will be considered U.S. citizens with the Jones Act of 1917. The Philippines will be told that they are on a path to independence, but the United States Congress will have to decide when it's ready. All of these places now will become sources of sugar without tariff because they're territories. And that's an important economic piece here. That's not to say that everyone was on board with having territories. There was an organization created in the wake of the War of 1898 known as the Anti-Imperialist League. And there will be all sorts of famous names that we've already encountered who will be members of that group for some very different reasons. Someone like Mark Twain, certainly Andrew Carnegie, their view was the US doesn't have colonies. We're not in the colony business. We were a colony, we gained independence. We don't do that to other people. Mark Twain, by the early 1900s, had been doing all kinds of investigative journalism. He'd gone to places like Congo. He'd seen how King Leopold's Belgian government had treated Native people in that part of the world, and wanted really to expose the dangers of imperialism, the cruelty, and the other problems that come about with that kind of power relationship. Andrew Carnegie decided that he was going to try to put his philanthropic impulses to some good. He attempted to buy the Philippines' independence. So at the time that the US was signing the Treaty of 1898, he attempted to make that purchase on behalf of the Filipinos so that they could have independence. And the United States rejected that overture. Samuel Gompers, the head of the AFL, he was a man ahead of his time. He saw the millions of people living in the Philippines as not just simply a new commercial market, which is certainly how a lot of manufacturers saw our acquisition of the Philippines. He said, if you're not careful, you're going to have all these companies outsourcing. And he was about 80 years off on that. But he wasn't wrong that that potential market of buyers would eventually become a potential market of cheap labor. People like John Sherman, Jane Addams, William Jennings Bryan, their views about imperialism had more to do with their understanding of progressivism and populism of the day. John Sherman, Jane Addams, right, were in the assimilation business. And so they looked at, this idea that you really could not easily turn a Catholic Spanish speaking Filipino into an American. And perhaps we shouldn't. And certainly some of their prejudices of the day existed. Jane Addams said that she'd been running Hull House for years, and she said it's very challenging to try to take adults and make them Americans. And that might be something that happens generationally, but why would the United States to choose to turn to do that, considering that we were already discussing whether or not it was viable to continue to have unrestricted European immigration. William Jennings Bryan, he was someone who felt on principle we didn't have colonies, but also, again, going to this idea of what he perceived to be non Christian people. Catholics are Christians, but based on his Protestant fundamentalist view of religion, he felt that the people who were of the former Spanish Empire, that those colonists in no way would be able to function within the larger American society. So the effects of the war, well, William McKinley as president is now a hero. We were challenged. We had a ship destroyed. We gave liberty to Cubans. He wins re-election in 1900 and chooses this new hero that's on the rise, Theodore Roosevelt, to be his vice president. And as we know, McKinley is assassinated within a year, and TR and his progressive impulses take over. In terms of our foreign policy, that will radically change. We had very little long term negotiation about anything, commercial or otherwise, with other nations once we come out of the early Republic era of the 1800s. But certainly, the United States now is looking at the potential to have economic control all over the globe and wants to be able to compete with the big boys, with the Great Britons, the Germanys, the France, Belgium, Russia. All of these places have colonies, and many of them have spheres of influence in China. And the United States is interested in getting in on that and what they call the open door policy, that the door should be open for the US to begin to do this. But the US has always talked about encouraging a growth of Pacific markets. They were doing that as early as the 1850s, and we certainly see that continuing on in this time period. But open door policy is going to be based ultimately on this idea that if all these other large, powerful Western European nations can have trade control of different portions of China, that the United States should be able to. And so overnight, you're going to see American diplomats and missionaries, people who are involved in, building railroads, you name it, wanting to go to China. And very early on, we're going to see a reaction to that. What was known for about 50 years as the Boxers, or the Order of the Righteous Fist, they were Chinese people who did not want to see foreign influence and did not believe that the Qing dynasty was the legitimate government anymore of China because it had allowed all of these spheres of influence. In 1899, there was a rebellion in Peking, the capital city, which now is known as Beijing, against these foreigners. And the United States will actually send the Marines in to break up that rebellion and rescue its own people. So the US is committed. It's not just an idea that we want to have a sphere of influence. We're willing to take action in order to have it. So another fun picture of TR, this time in his clothes from his Rough Rider days. But you can see that he has this huge shovel and he is literally digging a canal. And we've talked about him as a progressive, but he also believed that the United States had now reached a point where it should be claiming a bigger role on the great world stage. And part of that will involve the US building a Panama Canal. So we were a republic, and now we're an empire. We have territories. And how do we link the Pacific with the Atlantic? In 1900, well, the United States was like any other nation. It was going to have a navy to protect its interest in its oceans, and it had two that it now had to seek to protect. In order to bring the Pacific and the Atlantic closer together, and ultimately, based on TR's idea, to have a slightly smaller navy eventually, although we'll increase the size of it in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. He believed that by controlling so many islands in the Pacific and so much of the Caribbean, we were effectively putting ourselves in a place where we needed two navies, one to control the Pacific and one to control the Atlantic. And so his idea was that we would be able to affect the building of a canal. And the narrowest place is the Isthmus of Panama, and hopefully we could do something. Other nations had tried. France and Great Britain had both tried to build a canal back in the 1800s. The only other large project of this scale within this time period was something called the Suez Canal. And there was belief that the US could do it simply because it had enough money. And it was going to be able to, one way or another, get access to the land for this project. So in 1902, the United States will approach Colombia, which actually controlled the isthmus at that time, and said, we want to be able to lease the land or buy the land, but we want to build a canal. And Colombia rejected that offer. But the people who lived in that region, the Panamanians, didn't really care for Colombia's influence in their lives and was willing to have independence and a new best friend in the United States. So the US will actually send military forces and supplies to maintain order and ultimately facilitate this Panamanian Revolution. And as a result, we sign a very nice treaty with Panama in which we can build our canal. TR was a person who had views and could see a very large picture. So he was someone, as we know, could say, it's a coal strike. That's okay. I'm going to do something unlike any other president has done. I'm going to be on the side of the workers, and I'm going to try to negotiate a good settlement between management and labor. And in the same way, he looked at the US now vaulting itself onto the world stage as possible as well. But he believed that you were going to do that by having shows of great strength. And he used an old proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. And in his mind, a big stick was a very large and well-funded navy. He'll go so far to add a corollary, so an addendum to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904, where he will continue to state that the US is not interested in being involved in European affairs. We don't want to see Europe intervening in the Western Hemisphere. However, the US now might use the military to intervene if it's seen as a way of preserving order or stability. So if there's going to be some issue with what are the remaining European colonies of the Caribbean and South Americas or the Pacific, that the United States is certainly willing to use our military presence in order to preserve our interests, and particularly our economic interests. During his presidency, he will also ask Congress to build 16 new battleships, and you can see them here sailing on their great global tours. They were known as the Great White Fleet because their hulls were painted white. But for 2 years, he had the Navy sail all over the world. So to show other nations what the United States was capable of. It was at the time the biggest outlay of money and shipbuilding that a nation had done at that point. And you can see our artist here is making fun of this idea that now the United States has policing power in the Western Hemisphere. And TR here being depicted as the cop. But it did open up some questions. What does this mean that the United States was going to intervene in issues that might happen in the Pacific, but in China? Or is this only for the Caribbean? Or is this going to be globally? Like, where does this end? And we'll see as we go through the early period of the 20th century that events play out and the United States decides whether to be involved or not based on what in that scenario seems most advantageous to the United States. But TR said it's not true that the US feels any hunger or entertains any projects as regards to the other nations of the Western Hemisphere. except such for their welfare. The adherence of the U.S. to the Monroe Doctrine may force the U.S., however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of wrongdoing, to exercise police power. And we will see over the next 40 years, presidents keep coming back to that idea. When does the United States use its military for policing purposes? And it'll be surprising in Unit 7 when they choose to police and when they don't, and the consequences of those choices. We have another great picture here of TR being like a happy boy holding his big stick and pulling his little ships that he's just had built as he plays in the mere puddle of the Caribbean Sea. But ultimately, with relative size, we can see that the United States has great power and authority, particularly over the Caribbean and the other southern portions of the Western Hemisphere during the first decade of the 19th century or the 20th century. So the last piece is to also consider that the United States began its forays into the Pacific, its desire to build a naval base in Hawaii, um, its desire to be involved in what will become the War of 1898. Um, because the US saw there would be economic advantages, there were markets to be had. It's important to realize that the economy, the problems that people saw with overproduction in the 1890s, what caused the panic of 1893, to some degree, the speculation that led to the banking crisis in 1907, that the United States wants to make sure that it can continue to produce, but it can continue to sell abroad. And we'll see that the Taft administration that follows TR's is going to continue to talk about dollar diplomacy. And that is not going to simply be that we have a military for policing power, but that the United States might actually have to consider putting money, investing in lesser developed nations in order to facilitate economic growth in those places so they can afford American products. Dollar diplomacy doesn't go very far. We will see that there will be Americans buying land and developing mostly fruit plantations in South America and the Caribbean in this time. There was even discussion of building railroads in China and Russia, which will come to nothing. But the US actually, more often than not, will go back to the TR idea, which is we do have some economic interest in an area, and so we're willing to police it. We will send troops to Honduras and Nicaragua, both during Taft's administration. So some other things to consider, some other pictures. But it's important that we realize that we are going to be looking at political cartooning that represents the point of view of the people of the time. So the things that we saw expressed in terms of social Darwinism, we are going to see a lot of stereotypical drawing in the period. And so you can see that we have Uncle Sam here essentially holding back every stereotype of a European nation, including Germany, Russia, Italy, Great Britain in the back. And ultimately, it's in order so the US can expand and create these economic relationships. And you can see it is a very traditionally dressed person from China who is the figure receiving that money. But Uncle Sam, the caption says, I'm out for commerce, not conquest. And the question is, how true is that? Or are they perhaps one and the same? So as we close out, two things. So visualize what are the causes and what are the effects of the Spanish-American War, or as the College Board likes to often call it, the War of 1898. Being able to do a little T-chart, a little list from the notes in the presentation would be beneficial. The other thing is to consider now, as we're getting into more and more writing, can we look at the broader picture of these events and tie them to what we were looking at in terms of economic expansion and technological growth in the late 19th century, and also how these things will play out in the 20th century. So if we were looking at causation, cause and effect, a good question would be, how was the Panic of 1893 one of the long-term causes of American imperialism? what were three effects of this imperialism? So again, this idea that we can tie the economic to the military and the political. Change in continuity over time. How was territorial expansion of the 1890s similar to that of the 1840s? It's manifest destiny, but what's different about it in each time period? And then the last piece is argumentation. To what extent was the United States emergence as a world power motivated by the desire for economic growth rather than nation building? So, again, we are going to have to keep coming back to this idea of what was the ultimate purpose? Was the US looking to just grow its economy, or was it looking to further increase its national power and build up other nations as well? We will continue to see that as debate throughout this time period of Unit 7.